Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome to Synth Stuff. Version 2.2 of the firmware for the Novation Summit was released today. Let's upgrade my synth and have a look at what's been changed. So to upgrade the firmware of the Summit is not too painful. You use Novation components. Now you can either go to components website using Google Chrome, and that will actually connect directly to your Summit and identify that there's a firmware update and do it, or you can download the Novation Components application from the Components website as well, and you can run that locally in your computer. It will again then connect to Novation, identify that yes, there's an update available for your Summit, and we'll send it to it. I use the standalone application, but honestly, the standalone application just looks like a frame for the website. I think that's all it's doing underneath the covers. In any case, my upgrade wasn't painless. I started up the application. It immediately identified that yes, there is a Summit connected and it sees that it needs an update. So I said, okay, go ahead, do the firmware update. It then rebooted the Summit. My Summit came up into bootloader mode. However, the components application didn't recognize it. So after messing around for a little bit, I thought, okay, let's start again. I shut off the power to the Summit, turned it back on. So I power cycled it, rebooted it, came up fine. Reran the components application again. It again said, okay, I see the Summit. Hey, there's a firmware upgrade. Do you want to apply it? I said yes. And about 15 seconds later, it was done. And that was it. So I will power cycle a Summit because the last time we did a firmware upgrade on the Summit, it behaved a little bit strangely afterwards until I did power cycle it. So now it's been power cycled and we're good. So what is new and what's been changed? Well, there's not a whole lot of new stuff. This is not a feature upgrade. This is primarily a bug fix firmware update. One of the changes that they did make, which is something that was requested in the options, this is actually something that the HydraSynth recently added as well, and that it means that local mode is saved in the options. So if I go into settings and go to menu 4 and then, or menu 5 rather, and then turn on local mode or turn off local mode and save it. Now local mode is turned off. And what is local mode? It basically means that the keyboard is no longer connected to the synthesizer. The keybed sends MIDI out, and it's depending on your DAW or something else to send the MIDI back to the synthesizer. So if you don't have that loop in place, you end up getting no sound at all. And that's why synthesizer manufacturers typically don't turn local mode on in the settings that you can save, because people will turn it on and all of a sudden their keyboard doesn't work and they're like, oh, well, I'll turn it off and turn it back on. So I'll do that. I'll turn it off and I'll turn it back on. And that fixes everything, right? So now the synthesizer is gonna work fine and it still doesn't work. And they're like, oh, my synthesizer is broken. I better send it back for repair. In actuality, it's just the local mode has been turned off. So when you do turn this one on with local mode on, it comes up and tells you, hey, local mode is turned off, just to remind you that, hey, that's what's going on. So now I can go back into the settings and turn it back on and save that. And now the local mode is back on so that the keybed is connected to the synthesizer internally. So that's a new feature that was added in this firmware. One other feature that was added was the ability to switch local mode on and off via MIDI. So there's a CC, I think it's 122, that now allows you to turn local mode on and off remotely via MIDI. That's useful if you want local mode on normally for playing, but when your DAW is running, you may not want that happening. So your DAW could then turn it off, and then when your DAW is finished, it could turn it back on. That's it for new features. The rest is bug fixes. I will state right off the bat that the wet-dry bug in the effects is not fixed. They didn't address that. I know I've talked about this one before. I have a feeling this is a hardware limitation. It's how it's wired inside, or there's some kind of physical limitation in how the effects run, that the wet-dry mix does not work like you expect it would work. So I have a feeling that's something we'll just have to live with at the Summit. It's a peculiarity of the synthesizer, and that's the way it is. There was a bug that when you had spread mode and pan position of individual voices that you could suddenly sometimes get weird positioning of stereo voices in the stereo field. That was definitely a bug, and it has been fixed. In poly mode, when we were playing in unison mode, previously when you played legato, sometimes, particularly with long envelopes, sometimes all 8 voices would not get triggered, so you would get less than unison in poly mode. That is a bug. It has been fixed. And there was kind of an obscure bug that when it was freshly booted in poly mode, if you played more than 8 notes, so it bumped over into the second engine inside the Summit, because you know the Summit is actually 2 peaks inside. It has 2 separate peak engines. So in poly mode, you have 8 voices and 8 voices. It's actually 2 engines, and it just kind of overflows into the second engine. And after a fresh boot, sometimes if you would play into the second engine and then let up, you would end up with hanging notes that would continue to sound even though you stopped playing. That's been fixed. There was a bug in the reverb settings with the reverb size, where sometimes when you would recall a patch, the reverb size was not being recalled correctly. And more importantly, if you went into the menu and adjusted the reverb size and then adjusted it over on the panel, those 2 values didn't match. So that is a bug that has been fixed. The all notes off, CC 120, which is basically, it's like a MIDI panic. It means shut up, everything stop, all effects, all notes, everything. That wasn't working correctly. It is now. CC 123, where notes will stop playing, but it doesn't kill all the effects and everything, also now works properly. LFO fade sync determines the fade parameter on the LFO, whether it applies both poly and mono playing. Previously it was not working correctly. I believe it was the mono version where it would only affect the first note, and if you played legato, now that works properly. There were several instances where if you adjusted 2 different controls at once, so if I adjusted, for instance, the filter, and the filter value comes up and it shows what you're changing in the filter, and at the same time I started changing the pitch. So if you had multiple things being changed at the same time, sometimes the screen would get corrupted and you get random data on the screen. That's been fixed. Also talking about the screen, sometimes when MIDI events were being sent to the synth and the screen was asleep, so it was off, the screen was not waking up from those MIDI events. That's been fixed. This is a big one. When you were sending CC pairs, so MSB and LSB, so most significant bit and least significant bit. Basically, MIDI CCs are 7 bits, so you have a value from 0 to 127, which means you can get some stepping, particularly in things like frequency cutoff, where it's really noticeable and you have a large adjustment that can be made. Well, slicing that up into 127 slices means you can hear audible stepping. So what they do is they add MSB, which is your 7 bits from 0 to 127, and then they have an LSB, which is the least significant bits. So basically, in effect, you're getting more than 7 bits. It could be up as much as 14 bits of resolution, which means the stepping is not heard, because if you have 14 bits, that means you have 16,386, I think, different steps instead of 127, so the stepping isn't audible. However, the old firmware, the LSB was being ignored. So even though it accepted it, it wasn't actually processing it, and therefore you heard stepping when you were sending things like cutoffs and so on from your DAW. I really noticed this one, and this is one I'm really glad they fixed. It now listens for and acts on that LSB value when it's getting CC data coming from a DAW or another synthesizer. There was a bug with the arpeggiator that if you were playing notes and the arpeggiator was on, and then you disabled the arpeggiator while the notes are held down, then you turn the arpeggiator back on, re-enabled it, it had those notes cached and it would start playing them again even though you hadn't actually played a note. That's been fixed. And that's it. That's all the fixes we got for this version of the firmware. I know most of these I never really encountered myself. There are a couple that I know were pain points for me. Not really deal breakers, but they were, kind of an annoyance. And it's nothing like the previous firmware changes where there was broken stuff in here that just drove me crazy every day when I was trying to use it. The Summit now at the level of a firmware it's really kind of just like little touch-up fixes here and there, really kind of outliers. I know the Summit has some firmware growing pains early on, and that kind of reputation is kind of sustained, and people see the Summit and they think, oh, doesn't it have firmware problems? Not anymore. The Summit as it is now, and especially the version 2.2 firmware, is a whole machine. I have no qualms about recommending it wholeheartedly. It's solid, it doesn't crash. I didn't even know most of these bugs existed. It's reliable and it sounds fantastic. If you haven't seen my original review on the Summit, I'll put a link to it up here and in the description below. It's really something that if you have not played a Summit, the keybed is beautiful, the sound is beautiful, the effects are to die for. Head out to your local store and try one out, or check out some other videos online. And of course, please subscribe to this channel if you find anything here that you find useful. I really appreciate any comments that you leave in the comment section below. I do read all the comments, and if you have any questions or corrections, please leave them down there. And if you like this video, hey, why not click like? It helps me out a lot, because every time you click like or leave a comment or subscribe to the channel, it reinforces to YouTube that, hey, I'm creating content for people who like synthesizers, and it will show my content to other people who also have interest in synthesizers as well. Thanks for watching.